And this evening, just say a few words about these, what we just chanted in Pali. So these are recollections, according to the Buddha's recommendation, things to remember and think of frequently, qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So these qualities of the Buddha, Bhutto, the knowing, which is so commonly used in Thailand as a meditation object. And I'm guessing maybe if a lot of you grew up in a Mahayana Chinese Buddhist tradition, maybe you've grown up hearing the mantra Aimitofo being used. And the reason this is such a good mantra is it doesn't just engage thinking when we use it, but also the meaning of the word Buddha, of the Buddha's name. So I apologize, I don't know what the meaning is for Amitofo, but Bhutto in Pali is the one who knows. And this is what Lompo, Sumedho, the Buddha himself, and all the teachers keep pointing to, this knowing. And I've been trying to kind of bring your attention back to that through the guided meditations today. So we can use techniques and we can use the teachings of the Buddha, this kind of wonderful toolbox of skillful means that he's left us. But always remember that the whole point of the Buddha's teaching is suffering and the end of suffering, and it is to be known. So this knowing is really a very important aspect of the teaching. So we can chant the praise of the Buddha, and if you read the English translation, which we might chant maybe tomorrow evening, it is very much praises of the qualities of the Buddha, Gautama, who lived 26 centuries ago. But these qualities are also just qualities of the knowing, of the enlightened mind, the mind that understands the Four Noble Truths and that is free. So when the Lompo keeps hammering away at trusting awareness, trust the knowing, that's what he's pointing at. It's very interesting that we're so addicted to what we know, things that we can know, that for my part at least, until the Buddha or the Kubajans, the teachers, have started pointing out the knowing, I really never paid attention to it. And we have a habit of sending the mind out towards objects that arise in consciousness, whether it's the body, whether it's sights, smells, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations in the body, or the whole realm of the mind. Those other four aggregates of memory, perception, feelings, emotions, thoughts, moods. So our relationship to these things, to sankharas, are that they can be known. And this recollection of the Buddha, recollecting the qualities of the Buddha, is really coming back and looking at what happens when we come back to the knowing. What is it? So sometimes it can sound a bit abstract, a bit ethereal, the knowing, trust and awareness, and people kind of wonder, trust and awareness. And they imagine something floating above the room, universal awareness, something else, and we're so accustomed to thinking and perceiving and relating to objects of consciousness that we try to objectify consciousness, something out there that we need to seek and find and know and trust. So just ask yourselves, am I conscious right now? We can all do that. And there's no one in this room who can answer no to that question. And when we ask ourselves that question, or if someone else asks you, are you conscious right now? You check. You're checking something and you know you're here. You know there's consciousness, there's awareness. We don't usually look at that. We don't usually pay attention to it. And just skim over it. Luang Por Chah compared it to the threshold of the door of the house. We're interested in being at home, and then we have to go out for work, for a walk, to see friends, whatever. The threshold of the house is the one place we pass most often, and we never pay attention to it. We're always paying attention to outside. When we're inside, we head out. When we're tired, we come back in. And consciousness is like that, this quality of knowing we tend to not recognize. And because we don't recognize it, we don't value it. We don't realize what it is, what its worth is. So recollecting the qualities of the Buddha and starting to come and investigate this ability we have, every one of us has to know our experience. So in all our relationship to everything is a relationship of consciousness, awareness, in relationship to objects of awareness, of consciousness. So this consciousness itself is not an object. It's like this hand. I can hold on to the microphone, adjust it, pick up the cup, the clock. So the hand has the ability to pick up things, to seize objects and hold them, but I can't hold my own hand. And Luang Por, he uses the image of the eye. The eye can see images, but it doesn't see itself. And yet we know the eye is there because it's seeing. So when we practice, what we're practicing is learning to recognize this ability to know. And at first we do it in relationship to objects. We don't know what it is on its own, and because it's not something that can know itself as an object, we don't know how to recognize it. So we can recognize it in relationship to the 6 sense doors. So now, right now, most of you have your eyes open. You're looking, seeing the floor, the ceiling, myself, whatever. And notice how you can project out, so we can look at each other and start being interested in the details of man, woman, sitting on a chair, on the floor, eyes open, closed, whatever. And then we're interested in what's happening out there. Or we can also sit here and notice that seeing is like this. This is what the experience of seeing is from these eyes. They're sensitive to light. And just stay with that for a sec. And when you do that, you're not paying attention to all the details of what's in the field of vision anymore. You're noticing seeing. And then you can also notice the awareness of this process. So in the Buddha's description, there's always any kind of contact through any of the 6 sense doors always arises with an object, an organ that does the perceiving, and this consciousness. So in the five aggregates, oftentimes people say, yeah, but the 5th aggregate, that's confusing. Because if Ngpa teaches that consciousness isn't born, doesn't die, and then in the 5 aggregates, it's impermanent, how does that work? And it's a valid question because vocabulary words sort of are limited and they can lend to confusion. But in this case of the 5 aggregates, sense consciousness is the way we experience consciousness through the senses. So consciousness itself is present, and yet the way we experience it through seeing, the organ is impermanent and the objects are impermanent. If we turn off all the lights in Singapore on a new moon, it'll just be pitch dark and there's no seeing. There's no light. Even if the eyes are wide open, you can wave your hand in front of your face and you don't see anything. So the objects are impermanent, the organ can be impermanent. We experience that when you put a people who are blind don't see anymore. When you pass out, the eyes usually don't register images. Sometimes you have a blackout, you're still aware. You're aware, I don't know if this has happened to any of you, when you feel you're blacking out. You don't necessarily pass out, but there's a moment there and the vision just goes for a sec. It's just a black field. The eye probably doesn't receive enough blood for a moment and stop registering images. And then before birth there wasn't an eye. After death the eyes stop working. So the organs, eyes, ears, nose, the tongue, this body that feels and registers sensations, they're impermanent. And then the 6th sense door is all these memories and thoughts and emotions. And the mind is kind of the perceiving organ. They're objects of the mind. And yet there's still consciousness there that knows experience. So it's interesting to investigate this in terms of just sitting here and watching the breath, using the breath as a tool. So when we don't intend to practice at all, we can just sit here and spend an hour looking at everyone in the room, daydreaming. But when we mean to practice, we use an object of meditation to help bring that attention that tends to scatter all over the place. Start collecting it. When it goes out there, we bring it back. It goes out here, we bring it back. So really literally collecting ourselves. That tendency to just go out in every which direction, we're gently bringing it back. And we use the object of meditation as the reference point to which we bring this back. And so our relationship to the breath now is one of knowing the breath. And where Buddha and Dhamma start coming together, what we chanted just now, the Buddha is well expounded by the Blessed One. It's present here and now, timeless. This is what we're coming back to. We're coming back to here and now. So the knowing can only be here and now. There is no other knowing than here and now. And the breath is happening here and now. So we're really bringing things back right here. And the reason it's timeless is because when we meditate like this, we don't remember the previous breath sensations. When we're coming back to here and now, we're just knowing the ones that are here and now. And anything we remember, it's not the past, it's just a memory arising in the present. out of those memories, in our minds, we create something that we like to call the past and decide it's real. Yet all the past that we believe in is made up of memories arising in the present moment. They arise and they cease. And we can just let them cease, or we can feed them and obsess about them. But that's all happening here and now. Any thinking about the future is thinking here and now. Those thoughts arise in the present moment. And the content is about tomorrow, which is the unknown, which is not certain what's going to happen tomorrow. So we imagine, we hope, we fear, we worry, get anxious, and all that is happening right here and now. So in order to learn how to recognize reality for what it is, in order to train ourselves, teach ourselves, and give ourselves the opportunity to recognize reality for what it is, we need to learn how to come back to here and now and just look at what's arising in the present and recognize it for what it is. So that if you think of the Dhamma apparent here and now, it couldn't be apparent anywhere else. It can't be apparent in the past. We create the past out of memories in the present. Sometimes we think, oh, I'm just an ordinary person. I've heard so many people say, I don't have much barami. I'll kind of work on it a bit in this lifetime, and then in the future, in another lifetime, maybe I'll get a chance to ordain and realize the Dhamma. It's fine to say that, but we just created an image here and now about the future. And if we grasp that image and we believe that it's actually true, well, we've just gone and given us a limitation. And we won't be able to transcend it until we realize this is just something we created out of thinking, out of memories, out of notions that we have. The reality of Dhamma is that it is apparent here and now. And there's this very beautiful phrase that you find in the suttas when the Buddha is talking about one of the disciples who realizes Dhamma. He always says he realized the Dhamma and was liberated here and now. He never says there and then. It's always here and now. It's a very beautiful reminder. So we need to use these qualities of the Buddha and the Dhamma that the Buddha gave us to reflect on, to help remind ourselves. Because it's so easy to say, lay life is so busy, there's no way I'm going to realize the Dhamma in this lifetime, another one. And if we don't examine that statement, I can do that as a monk as well. I can say, this time around I ordained a bit late, I was already 31 years old, and now I'm looking after Lumpur, so I'm very busy, I don't have time to meditate. And if everybody's wishes come true, that Lumpur lives until 120, I'll be 81. I go, okay, I spent this lifetime looking after Lumpur, I can kind of realize the Dhamma next lifetime. And this is not to say that this is true or false. It's a creation in the mind. That's the reality of that thought. This is the nature of thinking. We're able to think everything and anything at all. Hitler thought that Jews were to be exterminated, and look at where that led. People think that there's a conspiracy theory about lizard people that come from space, and they've kind of mingled with the powerful of the earth. And so basically the lizard people control humanity. We can say it, we can think it, and some people even believe it. So thinking can really produce anything at all. And thinking also produced these teachings that the Buddha gave us. So there's thinking that is in accordance with reality, and then there's thinking that is just delusion. It's just fabrications, and it has absolutely no basis in reality, or some, but not all. So when we contemplate these qualities of knowing and knowing reality here and now that is timeless, the more we look, the more interesting it gets, and the more we're drawn inwards to this knowing quality of our experience. Opanaiko sometimes is translated as leading onwards or leading inwards, which is really the same thing. It's leading onwards in the practice or inwards in terms of coming back to this knowing here. And Pachatang Veditabo Vinyuhi, to be known individually by the wise. So don't go and imagine that you're not wise and other people are wise and they can know the Dhamma. The Buddha is telling us we can all know for ourselves. And understanding reality for what it is what wisdom is about. These qualities of the Sangha are very beautiful qualities to recollect as well, because we can imagine them to be just the Arya Puggala of the time of the Buddha and those that are still alive today, that have practiced well, that have practiced directly, that have practiced insightfully, that have practiced with integrity, and they are worthy of offerings, they are worthy of respect, worthy of invitation, and they are a field of merit for the world. It is true. But the whole Buddha's teaching is about bringing it back home. So how do we bring that back home? Practicing directly, practicing insightfully here. We can do it. We have the ability to do this. Using the Buddha's teachings to guide us towards this Dhamma that is timeless. Developing insight into that. Coming directly to the knowing here and now of the way it is. And then you start respecting that in the heart. It's not self. You can't create a sense of self out of insight. When insight arises, it's just realization. Afterwards you can think about it, put words to it, and get attached to the words. But that which knows is not the same as that which is going to think about it and talk about it. So we all, along the path of practice, develop insight. Every time we listen to the teachings and we sit together like this and start looking at the present moment, just sitting with his body, with his mind, and learning to see them in terms of what they are, in terms of Dhamma here and now, rather than in personal terms. Every time we do that, and that we gain some understanding in this, in the process of how we do take these things personally, and then create a sense of personality out of it. And then when we see that, we see how not to do that, how to let bodies just be bodies. Every insight along the way is Ujjupatipanno, Jnanapatipanno. It's all Sangha in the heart, is the qualities of good practice growing in the heart. And they inspire respect, a sense of respect in these things that are growing in the heart, that we're developing. I'd never heard anybody speak about the three refuges like that until I started spending more time with Luang Por Sumedho, because most of the time I've heard about qualities of the Buddha. The Buddha is that person who lived 25 centuries ago. And the Dhamma is this thing that they have realized. Sangha was these amazing monks that we get to go on a trip and go and pay respects to and listen to their Dhamma. And it does nourish faith, it does establish faith in the heart, and these beings are amazing. But as long as we don't learn how to bring all of that back in here, we're not practicing yet. We're just developing faith, but not wisdom. So every time Luang Por gives a talk, you'll keep hearing him talk about knowing, about awareness, about consciousness. He keeps coming back to that. Because that ultimately is the only refuge. It is the only thing that is here and now that doesn't change. And we need to keep being reminded of this, because our habit is probably the reason we keep being reborn again and again in this samsaric realm, is because we haven't understood this yet. We keep investing into the sankharas, into the body, getting attached to the body, either because attachment through liking or attachment through disliking. It can be both. Wanting it to be healthy, wanting it to stay young, not to get old. Or if we get old, not to suffer, not to get sick. Some people get so caught up in this business of how they want the body to be that they believe it's possible at some point to make it live forever. So they take all kinds of supplements and vitamins and substances, and then they prepare and start paying for a vault where it's going to be frozen. So that maybe now medical science can't make it live forever, but down the line in the future at some point. That's how much we ignore the reality of this body. It's impermanent. So when we keep out of habit attaching to this body, we're always going out from what Luang Por Chah calls our real home, which is this knowing, and we're going out into the world of experience through the body and through the mind, wanting the body to be a certain way, getting lost in it when it's pleasant, panicking when it's unpleasant, and frantically trying to scramble out of it, out of the experiences that arise. Not to mention memories and thoughts and moods. So our habit out of ignorance is to relate to all these things as in terms of me. And either it is me, I'm like this, or I don't want to be like that. And so we relate to things through kama tanha, like in terms of sense desires, I want pleasure, pleasurable experiences, or in terms of bhava tanha, I want to be a good monk, I want to be a good practitioner, I want to be a good person. When I was my first couple of years as a monk, my sisters asked me if I could write them letters just to let them know what was going on. And I didn't really see myself writing letters that often, but what I started doing is taking a blank notebook, and whenever it took me, I'd start writing something. And usually, after about a year and a half, the thing was full and I'd send it to them. And thinking back on what I wrote in those books, I was very inspired, but I was writing things because I was still looking at the practice from a point of view of self. When will I manage successfully to keep all the rules of Vinaya, all 227, that we chant twice a month, plus a couple thousand others. Purity. We're told about purity. So if you develop pure sila, then you get really good samadhi. So I want to get that. And then I want the samadhi. And you read these suttas, and the Buddha describes these fantastic paths that lead to complete enlightenment, and how you develop temporary concentration, and then access concentration. And after access, you have access to the jhanas. The 4 rupa jhanas, first, second, third, fourth, and I memorized all the characteristics, the way the Buddha describes them, and the metaphors. And the arupa jhanas, the formless absorptions, space, consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. I didn't have a clue what it meant, but I wanted all. I wanted it. And I would just write this. It was like wistful thinking, dreaming, aspirations, faith. And there's nothing wrong with it, but looking back on it, I realized it was all from a sense of me, not having any of that, suffering, being a putujana, wanting to get something out of the practice. And it's very easy to read the suttas, listening to the talks that monks give, in a way that feeds this very linear, sequential view of the practice. First, you've got to do this. First, develop generosity, because that's the first step. And then you start considering sila, because generosity is easier to practice, whereas keeping precepts, that's a little bit more challenging. So start with the first step, and then go on to the next step, sila, and then really develop that until you've got a really good sila, because that is the foundation for stillness of the mind. If we're still remorseful about our speaks and actions, every time we sit down, these memories arise, remorse arises, and the mind won't settle. So good sila leads to good samadhi. And then according to who you ask, you need at least upajjhara samadhi, but possibly 4th jhana, and then you can start doing vipassana. That's way down the road there. And then how much vipassana you need to do before you're finally free, that's out of sight altogether. And sometimes if we don't question the perspective from which we're looking at things, we'll just buy that as a line. And then we engage and we start kind of on this linear path towards enlightenment, where I'm here and I need to get there. And we forget all about knowing reality here and now, liberation here and now. All of a sudden we're stuck with an image of liberation there and then. We've got some work to do, but there and then at some point, maybe, perhaps. And if we feel hopeful, then we practice, and then every now and then we get really discouraged and we say, we can't do this, and we just get on with our lives. So it's very useful and very beneficial for us to learn to look at practice in terms of these qualities the Buddha gives us to recollect. The knowing. And the knowing is here and now. We learn to recognize sankharas as all those things which arise and cease. And at first we recognize some, and then we get a little bit of stillness, and in relationship to this level of stillness, we recognize an equivalent level of arising and ceasing, until we realize that this thing is changing as well. So that's another insight. And then we learn to become even stiller so that we can really appreciate how this too, which was our refuge, is actually impermanent. And little by little, we're going inwards. Learning to really recognize this knowing, which isn't born, doesn't change, doesn't die, which is always present here and now, and that we can know for ourselves. And if we keep coming back to this knowing this reality here and now, then it gives us a very different perspective on this path of developing generosity. Because we start recognizing what generosity does to the heart here and now. Maybe it bears fruits down the line as well. But we're happy to leave that to the law of karma. We're coming back to this refuge here and now. Learning to recognize the consequences of our actions by speech and by body. A part of training in sila, in an ideal world, we take the 5 precepts one day, and then we're good for life. But if you look at how they're worded, we undertake the precept of training for the sake of refraining from. It's not like a commandment that we need to follow, and if we don't, we go to hell. So the Buddha is really kind of pointing out these are tools to be used. And coming back to here and now, to what we can know, as we're learning to study the conditions of the body, the conditions of the mind. What allows us, what is helpful in coming back to this knowing. And then when we come to this position of knowing, we realize all there is knowing. There is no me and you and them. There's knowing sankharas. And the sankharas, like Luang Por was saying this morning, the sankharas might differ. These bodies are male or female, the sensations in the bodies are different. The memories you have and the memories I have are what we can attach to and say, this is me, my biography, my story. Or we can just say, this is just memories. Allow them just to be what they are. They are memories. We're not kind of denying that, but that's all they are. They're just memories. And there's the knowing of these memories. And as you let these go, you realize we all have these in common. We all have memories. We all have pleasant ones that we like to indulge in. We all have painful ones that we'd like to avoid. Sometimes the memories can be traumatic, and the emotional reaction is so strong that we don't yet know how to let go of them, how to allow them to be just what they are. And the same with thinking. We can all think. The higher level of education you have, the more you've trained and practiced and learned how to think efficiently. Luang Por Chah used to say that if you have a bachelor's degree in university, you have a bachelor's degree in suffering. If you have a master's degree in university, you have a master's degree in suffering. And if you have a PhD in university, you have a PhD in suffering as well. And you can see how that works, because we learn, society, this modern system of education teaches us to think very thoroughly, very well. And it is useful to get good jobs, to use thinking as a tool in life. But nobody teaches us how to put it down. So we learn the value of it, and then we end up stuck with it, and we don't know how to put it down. And when we start thinking about the future, which is uncertain, and we worry, then we don't know how to stop worrying. The other day someone was asking about a friend of theirs who's having a long-distance relationship, and this girl can't sleep at night because she worries so much, she's anxious, so she can't sleep and it's affecting her health. That's the result of thinking, of believing our thoughts and getting so caught up in them that we don't know how to put them down. Just leave them alone. It's not necessarily a question of stopping the thinking, because thinking is a sankhara, and thinking arises and ceases according to its own causes and conditions. But we're addicted to thinking, we're addicted to remembering, we're addicted to the objects of sense contact. Next time you go on holiday and you're somewhere beautiful, driving in the car along a beautiful scenery, enjoy your holiday, but out of the corner of your mind, keep an eye on what's happening in the mind. And you can spend a whole day sitting in a car, just stopping for food, for drinks, use the bathroom. Basically, you're not doing anything at all day. You're just sitting there, looking out the window. By the time you stop and it's evening time, you're absolutely knackered, completely exhausted from doing nothing at all. Until you realize what's happening is that we're consuming all these sights. I was watching that last summer with Luang Por. We spent the summer retreat period in New Hampshire. And some friends came to visit, and we organized a day out to drive up to this northern area of New Hampshire at the time of the New England summer, the New England autumn, that they call sometimes Indian summer, or around that period, where all the leaves of the trees turn this spectacular tones of orange and red and yellow, a lot of sugar maple, and it's absolutely stunning. And Luang Por, there's someone driving the car. Luang Por was sitting in front, so he had a good view of the road along which we were driving. And I was sitting on one side in the back. And you may have noticed I'm quite tall. So sitting in most cars, when I'm sitting straight, my eyesight is level with the top of the window, or pretty close. So I look out the window, I see tree trunks and the road. And this is a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It's like New England autumn. So I keep kind of bending down like that to get a view of the trees outside, and after a while my back aches and my neck aches, so I kind of sit up again, but I feel I'm missing out on stuff. So I lean forward and look between the front seat of the driver and the passenger, but again, it's leaning forwards, neck down, and no matter what I did, there was no way I could enjoy the spectacle comfortably. And it was really interesting watching the mind, because if I allowed myself to do that and try to consume all these sights and I noticed after a while that there's a particular tone of orangey yellow that I was always drawn to more than other colors. And so I'd look at all these kind of trees rushing by when you're driving at 60 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden you catch one that's just the right tone and it's gone. And this hunger to consume, to look at, to enjoy, to really feel that sense of like, look at that. It becomes a hunger, and trying to feed that hunger is absolutely exhausting. And so I allowed myself to do it for a bit, just to be able to watch what happens when I do follow this desire, when I'm really, and just watching that process of sort of coming back here and now, connecting with this knowing that seeing is like this, and then following that and noticing this sense of really sending the mind out into the world. What's the consequence of that? What's the result of that? So desire arises, and we want to gratify desire, and in order to gratify desire, got to keep looking for more, looking for the next orange tree, or stopping somewhere, taking photos, and then the photos never look like the real thing. And it's basically a program of disappointment. Even if desire is satisfied for one bit, it arises again right away, and then that one needs to be satisfied. Before you know it, you've left the valley and those beautiful yellow orangey trees are no more, and it's just the drab red ones and yellow ones, and still very beautiful, but they're not the same as down that road. And I did that several times during that day, driving up this valley and back down, just allowing myself to follow desire and try to kind of consume that and see how happy I could actually make myself by seeing those beautiful colored trees. And then coming back, sitting, and just noticing, the knowing. What does that feel like? And I could still sometimes just lean forwards and allow that kind of the beautiful trees to be within the field of vision, but coming back to the knowing. And it's a very interesting experience because you're not satisfied. You don't get that satisfaction of getting a hit out of every tree that passes that's the right color that makes you happy. But what you're coming back to is much more peaceful than that. It's not excited by the happiness. You can still see the trees and they're still pleasant to see. But the tree passes and the pleasant feeling from seeing that tree passes as well. And because at that time the business is not to kind of grasp desire and gratify it, we're willing to let desire come and go, let sights come and go, let pleasure come and go from this refuge of knowing. And it's a real relief, because it's absolutely exhausting, satisfying desire. Whereas coming back to this, you're relinquishing desire. Doesn't mean you get rid of it. You're relinquishing sights, beautiful sights. Doesn't mean you get rid of them. You still see them. So sight is still happening. Pleasure still arises. But all of a sudden we're not coming from a place of desire anymore. We're coming back to the knowing. And inevitably, it's impermanent. That's the nature of the trip. That's the nature of the colors in the autumn. And from that position of knowing, there's a natural acceptance that what arises and ceases in the field of knowing, in consciousness, is impermanent. This is the position from where we can recognize that. So this is where what we can come back to, where we let go. And if what arises is pleasurable, that's fine, it's okay. But our refuge is the knowing, our standpoint is the knowing. And as long as we stay there, we're safe from the suffering that arises once we go out and grasp anything. And in order to recognize that, well, we have to study both. To this day, even though, to my understanding, Luang Por has finished his work, he still tells me about times when he's just sitting in his room and starts thinking about the future. So he picks up thinking, and climate change, and the economy, and the war in Ukraine, and crazy politics, right, left, and center, and watches how the thinking naturally, because the future is the unknown, the thinking starts creating scenarios, and worry follows, and anxiety and fear. So he does that, and then he puts it down and comes back to the sound of silence, to the emptiness, and all the worry, anxiety, and fear just dissolve. And we can do this in the practice and learn both from sankharas, what their nature are, and what happens when we follow desire, we grasp desire, and we follow either to try to experience sense pleasure, more of it, we try to become somebody or something, or when we're trying to resist and get rid of the parts of experience, those aspects of relating to the sankharas that we don't like. So using these recollections, it helps remind us what we're coming back to, this knowing. So when we sit here, in these kind of times that are designated for practice, we're coming back to knowing the breath. The breath is here and now. The knowing is here and now. And then the nature of the mind, our habits, are revealed through this cultivation. We decide for a moment to bring the mind, the attention back to the breath, and it goes off. We bring it back, it goes off again. You start learning about the restless nature of the mind. If it keeps going off to the same thing time and again, well, you can take a bit of time and start looking at that. Why does it always go after this thing all the time? And looking at it in terms of the Four Noble Truths, in terms of what desire, what form of desire arises that I'm following. So if we're daydreaming, thinking about pleasant stuff, that's part of kama tanha, sense desire. We've experienced something pleasant through the senses in the past, now we have this memory, and we keep bringing up the memory of former sense desire. And then we think about the future and we think we'd like to experience that again in the future. And we can spend a lot of time doing that, sitting right here. And so doing something as simple as that, just using the breath, coming back to knowing what there is here and now, what the breath is like here and now, that's our anchor. And then the habits in the minds, the memories, the thoughts that arise, sensations, whatever arises through the five sense doors, eyes, ears, smells, tastes, and just the sensations in the body, we can notice what the habits are in the mind in how we react to those. And the reactions are always coming from the fact that all contact is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And we, out of habit, react to pleasure by wanting to stay with it and wanting it to last forever. If it ceases, trying to get more. And out of habit, we relate to the unpleasant aspect of experience by either resisting it or trying to get rid of it, suppressing it. That's desire. It's either kama tanha, bhava tanha, or vibhava tanha. And then there's the knowing. And the knowing is always the escape and the refuge. Because we can know sense contact. We can know memories. We can know thoughts, moods, and we can know desire. Desire to be, desire to get, experience, or desire to get rid of. And every time we come back to that knowing, we're free from the conditions that arise and cease. Practice is going to reveal this. So we got to be willing to come here, sit down, as all of you have decided to do for a week, and meet experience. This is actually really quite praiseworthy what everyone is doing here, with being willing to just sit down and watch this body, this mind, and learn from it. Because this is what the first noble truth is about. The Buddha is just pointing out to the fact that there is suffering. How many people are willing to say, okay, let's go and meet that guy? It's not usually the way we react even to the word suffering. So being willing to sit down and open up, that's actually quite extraordinary. That willingness is an acceptance. Trust that. Because where that's coming from is also this intuitive sense of knowing. It's very difficult to convince someone rationally to go out and meet suffering. But then where wisdom arises is not in thinking. The real wisdom arises in the heart, in the knowing. And because this knowing is a refuge, when we keep coming back to it, we're cultivating it as a refuge. We're learning to trust it. Like when we meet someone new, first we don't know them, and we're polite and we spend a little time of it, talk a little bit with them. If it's nice enough, thank you very much, well, I don't mind seeing that person another day again. And the more time we spend with them, the safer we feel with them, because they never say or do anything that feels threatening to us. So we really enjoy being around that person. That's trust. It's something that grows through experience. So trusting awareness, as Luang Por keeps teaching us, something we need to come in contact with and learn to know the value of this refuge. And like he himself does, yeah? Like don't be afraid of grasping desire, grasping sankharas, but with this intention to understand what's happening, to understand what the consequences are of attaching, of grasping. And meeting suffering. So we learn to kind of realize that we can actually sit here, for example, and have a sore knee or a sore hip, or our bottom is going numb because we haven't moved for a while. And just sitting with it, you can see this process, when we're sitting down, first we sit down and feel comfortable enough, sigh and start relaxing, and we come to the breath. And the only thing distracting us sometimes is memories, thoughts and stuff. But little by little we start settling down, and all of a sudden this guy starts hurting. And the mind goes out to it and starts worrying a bit. Is it just going to stay like that, or is it going to get more and more? Because if I have to do another 45 minutes, I'm never going to get there. This is going to be... We're not anywhere. It's just a light pain in the knee. But we've gone and grasped it and started thinking about the future, and all of a sudden we're imagining 45 minutes down the line is going to be excruciating, and we start panicking, and we need to change postures. And actually all we felt was a bit of discomfort in the knee. So when we're willing to kind of start investigating how we react to life, we take something as simple as that arises in the practice, and we say, okay, right now it hurts a little bit. This I can endure. Let's see what happens. If it does become excruciating, by all means, change postures, but challenge yourself to watch it and notice all the fabrications that arise in the mind, the thoughts about how terrible it could get, the people who've trashed their knees sitting too long and end up sitting in chairs all the time. They can't sit on the floor. Or maybe you've had an accident in the past and the knee is sensitive and you don't want to have an operation. Like all of this is just mental proliferation. It's suffering because it's unpleasant. It comes up with fear and worry and the pain. So there's the suffering of the physical, the unpleasantness of the physical sensation, and then there's all this suffering that arises in the mind with it. And to be willing to meet that. Be willing not to change postures just for a little while longer. For the sake of just watching what happens, for knowing, understanding the body, where does this actually lead? What is the nature of a pain in the knee? And also, and more importantly, what is going on in the mind? Why was I able to stay so comfortably with the sensations of the breath until this pain in the knee started? And now I can barely watch one in-breath or one in-breath and I'm back on the knee. This sense of coming back to here and now and being with the breath sometimes comes with a sensation of really being centered here. And then the pain in the knee arises and you can literally sense yourself leaving the center and going off to the periphery of the body. Be willing to investigate that. What's happening? Do we have the patience to just be with it? Can we also allow it to be a situation where the body is teaching us its limitations? And if the body is of a limited nature like that and it doesn't take long before it hurts, how do we develop meditation where we can just sit still for hours and hours? Because the body is going to hurt. So how do we find that ability to sit with pain in the body, but we successfully stay with the breath? We can use willpower and concentration techniques to sort of block off the pain or whatever. But can we use wisdom? Because willpower is not going to last forever if we try that. And if wisdom is what leads to liberation from suffering, from this whole scenario that keeps arising in the mind that we keep getting caught up in because the pain in the knee. What is the wisdom that allows us to be with that and leaves us free? And that's when you start using all these tools that the Buddha gave us, starting with the knowing being a refuge, or you can just keep coming back to knowing the breath, knowing pain. But the knowing doesn't breathe, the body breathes. The knowing knows the sensations of the breath. And then when pain arises in the body, we're able to know pain. The knowing doesn't hurt, the knowing knows the pain. And the worry, if we think about it and fear what happens if we stay much longer, we can know thinking and worrying is like this. And the knowing doesn't think, the knowing does not worry, does not become anxious. The knowing isn't afraid. All of these things arise and cease in consciousness, and the relation to them is knowing them as things that arise and cease, as sankharas. When we come back to this knowing, and we can really appreciate this position of knowing, sensations in the body, knowing, thinking. Thinking is like this. If we believe the thoughts and then we go off and we're caught into the story, and then we come back and we say, whatever the thoughts are about is always just thinking. Knowing knows, and thinking comes and goes. And memories about pain in the past. You just keep coming back to this knowing. And then you're cultivating a relationship to it, which is pachatang veditabo vinyuhi. You're cultivating this understanding. You can know for yourself. This is the knowing, and this is an object that arises and ceases. Keep cultivating that. Sometimes the objects are screaming really loud at us. Pain that's unendurable, memories that are traumatic, terrible scenarios of the future that cause us impossible worry. We almost lose our minds. This can happen. But in a context like this, we're staying at Meng Monastery. The conditions provided to us are comfortable enough, they're safe. We have food and drinks, we have a resting place, we have quite decently comfortable seats to sit on and meditate. So we're unlikely to experience something akin to crucifixion or anything like that. So we can train with the little things. And sort of challenge yourself in the meditation. And when you're sitting, when you're walking, challenge yourself to stick with it, with a knowing or with the object of meditation, and try to stay with that. And when I don't think there are mosquitoes in this room, but sometimes it feels like there's a mosquito landing on your cheek or on your arm or something. Don't open your eyes, don't check. Even if it is one, no big deal, but most likely is not, and just watch the mind with your eyes closed, wondering whether it is a real mosquito or not. And notice the desire to go and scratch the itch, relieve the tickle. Don't do it. Resist that. Just stay breathing in, breathing out, and you'll find yourself kind of holding on to the breath a little bit tighter because there's a challenge now. But just stay with that. And what you're trying to do is just trying to develop this freedom from the urge to go and look, scratch, itch, whatever it is, which is the conditioned response to something that's a little bit unpleasant, is get rid of it. Am I able not to follow that? And then you're coming back to this position of knowing, sensation. It's a little bit unpleasant, maybe a little bit painful, and there's this urge to get rid of it. And you determine to know all of that. Not to follow it. Otherwise what we do every time we follow it, we're cultivating slavery to desire. Every time we want something good, we have to go and get it. Every time we experience something unpleasant, we have to find relief from it. Then we're slaves to desire. So becoming free means we come back to this position of knowing, and we allow it to be. We allow the sensation to be what it is. We allow the feeling, maybe unpleasant, just to be what it is. Allow the desire to relieve, to scratch, to itch, to change postures. Allow that desire to arise in the heart. Allow it to arise in consciousness so that you can know it. You can feel it. Desire is like this. But knowing doesn't desire. Just keep coming back to that. And little by little, by using the small opportunities that arise every moment of conscious life, and observing what happens when we do follow, and observe what happens when you come back to the knowing and stay with that, choose to stay with that. Appreciate the difference. And inevitably, the picture that reveals itself, that each one gets to know for ourselves, is how grasping desire and following it leads to more suffering. Every time we come back to the knowing, suffering just arises and ceases, but the knowing doesn't suffer. So that's where suffering ends. That's Nirodha. So we learn to trust that awareness with these small challenges, all these small opportunities we get all day. And don't underestimate how much learning comes from that. Sometimes we may have the notion that in order to become proficient, we need to learn with the little things first, and then we upgrade to tougher stuff, and we go up level by level, and again we're thinking in a linear way. But when you practice like this, practice with the small things, it's not about the things themselves, whether they're small or big. And that if you only practice with the small difficulties of life, you've got to go out and meet greater difficulties to improve your ability to let go of them. That's not how it works. Because even with the small things, what we are practicing is recognizing it, coming back to the knowing. We're practicing that, letting go and coming back here, and learning to trust this. This grows, the ability to recognize and let go of things, the ability to trust the knowing. And then you'll be surprised when a bigger challenge comes around that you were not expecting, and you know how to recognize, let go, and come back to the knowing. So what we have the opportunity to do here this week in these very beneficial circumstances is just that. All these little things that arise through the day. Just use it. Use sitting, walking, standing, lying down later at night. Use the breath. Use the thinking, the remembering, the moods. Every day we get up, it's a different mood. Throughout the day, the moods change. Our emotions arise and cease according to what's happening inside, outside. Use that. And every time you wonder, how do I use this for practice? Just come back to the knowing. Can I know this? Can I know this mood, this thought, this sensation? Can I know the body being like this? And keep coming back to the knowing. And then when Luang Por says, trust the knowing, then you know what he's talking about. You're learning that, you're teaching yourself. So I think I'll stop here for this evening. I hope this serves as a beneficial encouragement. So maybe we can just pay respects to the Triple Gem together.